The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus taught us you can never step into the same river twice. But of course, we can't even step into the river the first time because it's always ever changing. It's never the same, never the same river. That's something about the Jewish experience as well, that we enter an experience, let's say the days of awe, the Yamim Noraim, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim. And even though each of us has a memory of the first time we were taken to synagogue, maybe the first time we heard shofar, the first time we were there at the end and the power of Ni'ilah at the end of Yom Kippur, but in fact, we're stepping into an on-flowing stream. The power of the past to shape the Jewish present and the Jewish future is one of the central themes in the writings of Shai Agnon, S.Y. Agnon, Hebrew literature's only Nobel laureate. It's present throughout his works of fiction, and it's all over the place in his great anthology, Yamim Noraim, in English as The Days of Awe. It's quite interesting that although there are 23 volumes in the collected works of Agnon, mostly works of fiction, it's this book, a non-fiction collection of Jewish sources about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the days in between, which is his best-selling work. I imagine that for most of us, we have never attended synagogue on the high holy days without having at least someone in our row holding a copy of this book, either in Hebrew or English. Perhaps it was you yourself who brings the book every year. And Agnon says that was the very purpose of why he wrote it. The book was part of what was called the Mifal HaKinus, the great ingathering project, the anthologizing project that was very much part of Jewish culture, of Hebrew culture in those days of the 1920s, 1930s, an idea that we had to collect together the treasures of the Jewish people, the treasures of biblical and midrashic and rabbinic and medieval and Hasidic literature, and present it in a format that could be digested by new generations of Jews here in the land of Israel, although throughout the diaspora, who were something of a remove from the tradition. Of course, perhaps the most famous example of this, would be the Sefer Agadah of Chaim Nachman Bialik, collecting together, anthologizing, and presenting in reworked and reformatted form for the Israeli public, and then later translated into English, the great Agadot, the legends of rabbinic literature. Agnon describes his intentions in composing The Days of Awe, which was first published in 1938 and then reissued in a second edition in 1946. These dates are really bookends around the great trauma that befell the Jewish people between 1938 and 1946, and I trust you in the audience understand what I'm talking about. The nostalgia, the power of the past, that aching feeling that we can't go back, but we need to find a way forward, is the description that he brings in the introduction to the second edition. In the English edition, which I'm sure many of us have and read, it's important to note the English edition is slightly abridged from the Hebrew. It's probably about 85–90% identical to the Hebrew text, but there were some abridgments in the translation. And oddly, among them is the absence of the Hebrew introduction, which I've translated for our purposes here. It's a description of his memories of entering the river for the first time, of entering Yom Kippur as a small child. It's a very, very rich and pregnant text describing the uplift and the sanctity of that experience. And he says, the heavens were pure and the earth silent and all the streets were clean. And a new breeze, or perhaps a new spirit, ruach chadash, wafted through the air of the world. I was a child of but 4 years of age, dressed in holiday finery, and a relative brought me to my father and grandfather in the house of prayer. The synagogue was full of men wrapped in talitot, with silver crowns on their heads, white clothing and prayer books in their hands. Many candles were affixed into long boxes of sand, and wondrous light and a pleasant odor came from the candles. An old man stood bowed by the prayer stand, his talit hanging down to below his heart, with a sweet sound emanating from below his talit. I stood on the synagogue windowsill, trembling and amazed at the sweet voices and silver crowns and wondrous light and honey smell coming from the wax candles. It seemed to me that the earth I had walked on and the streets I had passed through were nothing but a passageway to this house. This particular phrase has become so popular that it adorns so many wedding invitations here in Israel, although taken out of context, that life is, of course, a passageway to the house that the young couple will build together. But in Yamim Noraim, Agnon is describing the entry to the prayers of Yom Kippurim, that his whole life, of course, he's only a small child, but when you're a small child, you think you've lived a lot. But his whole life has been just to get him to this highlight, this sublime moment of sanctity. In the Hebrew, the phrase is Eino ela prosdor lebayit hazeh. It's reminiscent of a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, that this world is only the prosdor, the passageway to the world to come. So he's intertextually playing and being clever and trying to say something that the experience of tasting Yom Kippur as a small child and seeing the men standing there with the talitot on and the chazan reciting the prayers and the candles and the smell and the experience and the energy of the room is somehow a taste of Gan Eden, a taste of the world to come. Still, I did not yet know how to form sophisticated thoughts. I didn't know what Hadrat Kodesh, sublime holiness. It was unknown to me. He knows he's experiencing something, but he's not exactly sure how to put it into words. But you know it when you see it. There's no doubt that in my heart at that moment, I sensed the holiness of the place and the holiness of the day and the holiness of those people standing in the house of God in prayer and song. And even though until that moment I had never seen such a thing, it seemed to me that it was eternal and uninterruptible. It's his first memory of being taken to synagogue. Little children weren't taken to synagogue in those days until they could conduct themselves with a little bit of proper behavior. It's his first experience in synagogue, and what an experience it is. It's not a weekday afternoon service, it's Yom Kippur, and we all know what that's like. Even in synagogues which are sparsely attended, on Yom Kippur, people who don't attend all year, they show up. The place is full, it's packed, there's energy, there's a feeling, there's sanctity, even the sanctity and the sublimeness that he can't describe, but he feels it in his bones. And he imagines that's what synagogue is. Like, imagine that going to synagogue any day of the year is the experience of Kol Nidre or Ni'ilah. But he doesn't know that's not the case. Great joy was in my heart, which clung in love to the synagogue and those people and those tunes. Soon enough, the tunes stopped, but still a heavenly echo, a bat kol, it's a type of low-level prophecy, was humming until it too stopped. My soul suddenly protested, and I burst out in tears. My father and grandfather were horrified, and all the people tried to calm me down. I stood bawling with tears rolling down my face. They asked each other, "Who caused this child to cry?" They answered each other, "Who knows?" Now I'll tell you who caused me to cry. At the moment the prayer stopped, the beauty of that moment stopped. He imagined that what he was experiencing was 24/7. He believed in the illusion, in the magic of what we achieve on Yom Kippur, thinking that that's the default all the time. But you know how it is on Yom Kippur. We're standing like angels in prayer, and as soon as there's that break, maybe in the afternoon or in the evening when the prayers are over, well, how much idle gossip is spoken just on the way out of shul itself on Yom Kippur. It's easy, very easy, to fall from that state of exalted existence back to the day-to-day. He didn't know that. He was as yet still illusioned. I remember once someone telling me that they took their children to Disneyland or one of those types of amusement parks, and they have the characters dressed up. Let's imagine it was Mickey and Minnie. And they bring the little child. It really is the Magic Kingdom. There's a reason they call it that. And when you're a little kid, you think that really is Mickey Mouse. But something happened, and Mickey's costume came off, and the child discovered it wasn't really Mickey Mouse. The magic, the illusion was broken, and they busted out crying. They were horrified. It was frightening. It was unreal. Something like that is happening here, but we're not talking about an amusement park. We're talking about standing in synagogue, to which he's already compared to the world to come. But he realizes, he peeks behind the curtain and understands that all of these holy angels among whom he's davening, they're really just people of flesh and blood with all of their failings. And as soon as the prayers were over, they start chit-chatting with each other. And that's what caused his sorrow. The illusion was broken. It matters little whether this can be relied upon as actual autobiography. It's the story that Agnon tells about his initiation to Jewish prayer on the high holidays. Those people whom I love changed their appearance, ruining the beauty of that place and that day. For that reason, my heart ached, and that is why I burst out in tears. And then he describes that's the reason he wrote this anthology. He worked for 2.5 years, 16 hours a day, collecting and sifting and refining the sources from the entirety of the Jewish bookshelf, in which he was quite fluent and expert, in order to produce and sift through and create this anthology, which he says he hopes would be an antidote to the challenge of rising to the occasion on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That when the prayer isn't going on, when we're not standing on the shoulders of giants, when we remember that we're, just very, very flawed flesh and blood, well, we might pick up the book and fill those minutes and those hours with it and maintain a bit of our sublime, exalted status. The book itself is, of course, a distillation of the entirety of the Jewish bookshelf. In his fiction, part of what Agnon was doing was to take all of those sources, primarily the rabbinic literature, to distill it and to pour it out into the mold of modern literature. In Days of Awe, he's giving it to us almost directly, almost unmediated through his work as an author of fiction. And part of what he's doing is trying to say that his work, both his fiction and his anthologies, are a reflection of the fall from sanctity, are a reflection of the challenges of modern spiritual existence, in which we have difficulty maintaining the heights that we sometimes achieve. It's that fall from grace, if you will, pardon the expression, which causes the modern anxiety. We know what we're capable of, but yet we know how often we don't achieve it. And he's giving us a leg up, maybe a little step stool on which to stand to reach the heights. The great literary critic Baruch Kurzweil, who was a pioneer of analyzing and interpreting Agnon's stories, said the following in response to the Days of Awe when it appeared. He says in the introduction, this beautiful description of his first childhood experience on Yom Kippur, which is called Zikaron B'Sefer, the remembrance in the book. And the centrality of Zikaron here should not be understated. Memory and the power of memory and the force of memory on shaping our current experience is quite profound, and it's connected with this topic of nostalgia, which I'll come back to momentarily. So in that introduction to Days of Awe, in the second edition, the 1946 edition, it is as if the last partition has fallen and we're given a glimpse into the deepest depths of the entire great artistic enterprise, Agnon's great artistic enterprise. It's impossible to go beyond the linguistic perfection of this brief introduction, in which Agnon takes a step beyond the function of literary art. He establishes us anew the lost unity that becomes again present. What once was now returns, because Yom Kippur is renewed each and every year. And because of this, every person in Israel can enter and embrace the atmosphere of the sacred space of the holy day. But since we are still interested in a modern artistic text, he also raises the other side of artistic function, the first hint of the rupture, of the division, of the loss of unity. This idea of the nostalgia, this idea of Agnon both being a purveyor of classical texts, but also a completely modern artist. This will be one of the main themes that we'll discuss in our next session when we look at actually one of his works of fiction connected to Yom Kippur. This balancing between entering and embracing the atmosphere of the sacred space of the holy day, but also the rupture. Modernity, modern literature is not some kind of guide to the perplexed. It has to describe the traumas of life. It has to describe the calamities that befall the Jewish people. It has to enter the space of transition, the liminal periods between then and now, between the old world and the new, between a world in which faith is kind of absorbed by osmosis through your mother's milk, and a world where doubt is the fabric of existence. And even people of faith in the new world have to generate for themselves a new form of faith. It has to be earned in ways that pre-modern man could take for granted. And in those transitions, in those moments of transition, which for Agnon artistically are often depicted symbolically as transitions between points in time, that moment where the weekday turns into the Sabbath, the anxiety that we feel on the eve of Yom Kippur, standing before this great challenge and not sure whether or not we'll be able to rise to the occasion. Those liminal spaces where we're caught in between. He often symbolically represents it with the image of a bridge that tries to get from point A to point B, and we're not always sure that we can get across that bridge. And these are stories of high anxiety and challenge and doubt and being tasked with sometimes very simple responsibilities, and knowing that no matter what we do, we will be caught in between. Very often there's an indeterminate ending. We, the reader, have to interpret what we think happened. Was there success or was there failure? And I guess depending upon who we are, we can interpret the story differently each time we come back to it. Agnon once famously said that any story not worth reading twice probably wasn't worth reading the first time. And it's true in the sense that each time you step back into that river of Agnon's writings, it's a different river. It's a different story. It's a different novel, not because the text has changed, but because you, the reader, has changed. And this tension between now and then and the present and looking at the past, this is a source of nostalgia. Nostalgia isn't what we often think it is. We often talk about nostalgia. Maybe there's a class reunion of people you haven't seen, depending on how old you are, in 20, 30, 50 years. And you talk about those old days. Talking about remember when, that's not nostalgia, at least not in the technical sense. Nostalgia is a Homeric word from the times of the Odyssey based upon the roots nostos, which means homecoming or returning home. Like Ulysses, who has to return from the war back home only to discover that his whole world has changed. An algos, pain, like analgesic. An analgesic is a pill that works against pain. So nostos algos, nostalgia, is the pain of trying to return home, the pain of trying to step into the river and imagining it will be the same river. And in this period, specifically the period between the wars, between World War I and World War II, it was a moment of high nostalgia. It was a moment of great anxiety because the world was aware, although they were unaware of what was about to come in the 1940s, the world was aware that everything had changed. We often overlook the impact of World War I because, frankly, it's overshadowed by World War II and in the Jewish experience, particularly by the Holocaust. But World War I was an unimaginable calamity throughout all of Europe. It affected everything, socially, economically, spiritually, religiously. The world was destroyed. And by the time it got back on its feet, it was visited with World War II. Agnon's little hometown of Buczacz, which we see here on the screen, that's the great synagogue and the study hall, the Beit Midrash, which play such central roles in his writings. Agnon leaves Buczacz, which today is a little town in western Ukraine. At the time that he lived there, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, it was the easternmost outreaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This little town, which he leaves at around the age of 20, but never leaves him. You can take the boy out of Buczacz, but you can't take the Buczacz out of the boy. And he spends the next 60 years trying to write his way back to this world that he knew even when he was there at the beginning of the 20th century. He leaves in 1908 to come on Aliyah to the land of Israel. Even then, he knew was a world in transition. He knew, as the author, the American author Thomas Wolfe said, you can't go home again. A comparison between Wolfe and Agnon would be quite interesting, but we don't have time for that right now. But this is really one of the great Agnonian themes. Home, trying to return home, knowing you can never get back, knowing you can't step into that same river twice. It's, of course, so present throughout the 1930s in Surrealism. Here's, of course, Salvador Dali, himself a rather surrealistic character with that mustache, and perhaps the most famous work of art from 1931, the same period that Agnon starts writing his own hyper-modernistic tales which are often compared to Kafka for their surrealism, a comparison that Agnon greatly objected to, but nevertheless a trenchant observation. Here, of course, Dali in the persistence of memory, and memory again, a central theme. Agnon calls his introduction Zikaron B'Sefer, a memory written down in the book. But memories are fluid. Everything is fluid. Even that great constant that we live by, time, well, Einstein had told us just a few years earlier, even that's relative. And here are Dali's clocks melting in the sun, as he said, like so much Camembert cheese. Reality is not what we think it is. And time is not what we think it is. And our experiences may not actually be as we remember them. And that idea that we can't go back, is always haunting the modern person. We see this in Agnon's, perhaps his greatest novel, the novel that was singled out for praise by the Nobel Committee, Oreach Natalalun, A Guest for the Night, which Agnon works on throughout the 1930s and is based upon the kernel of a biographical story called based upon the kernel of a biographical incident in which he does return home for a period of time. Aside from one very brief visit in 1913 when his father dies, he had never returned back to the old hometown. In 1930, Agnon was traveling through Europe, and he made a visit of less than a week, of a number of days, back in Buczacz, back in his hometown. By then, he was already a celebrated author, a celebrity, local boy who'd gone off to the land of Israel and had become, even then, in 1930, a great Hebrew author. His parents at that point had left this world. His siblings had left town. There were only a few distant relatives. And he comes now, having left at the age of 20, he comes now well into middle age, and is horrified by what he sees. He's horrified by the changes that the town has undergone during the war. And he writes a novel called A Guest for the Night, in which this unnamed guest returns to his hometown. This is very much parallel to Woolf's novel, You Can't Go Home Again, which is written about the American South, a good old Southern boy who makes his way to New York to become a writer, returns back home only to discover you can't go home again. It's fascinating, these two very important novels, one set on the American scene, the other in the Jewish scene between the land of Israel and Eastern Europe, have so many parallels, but I'm certain that neither of the authors knew of the other's existence, which is itself interesting. There must have been something in the water, something in the ether that was shaping the artistic consciousness. And as I said, those transitions from World War I and the impact that civilization had undergone, no doubt shaped their thinkings about these things. This guest returns to his hometown. And what does it mean to be a guest at home? That in and of itself is something surreal. Right? One can't be a guest in their home. It's an oxymoron, but it's an indicator. It's an indicator of being out of place, of being out of time, of being out of joint with reality. The novel begins with his arrival in town, set around 1930 when he actually made this visit, but instead of the actual week-long visit, the novel is spun out over the course of a year. The narrator, the narrating guest, who we, the reader, can be forgiven for thinking is Agnon himself, arrives on the Day of Atonement, on the eve of the Day of Atonement, on Erev Yom Kippurim, a very symbolic, very day pregnant with meaning, pregnant with anxiety, the eve of the Day of Atonement. We have to get ready. And besides all the work that has to be put into eating, because after all, one must eat on Erev Yom Kippur so that you can fast properly on Yom Kippur. But beyond that, one has to spiritually prepare for the Day of Atonement. And he arrives from this long journey back home. He has to find a place to stay, and he has to arrange to get to synagogue, unaware of the degree to which the town had really deteriorated since he had last lived there in the first decade of the 20th century. And this is how the novel opens. On the eve of the Day of Atonement in the afternoon, I changed from the express to the local train that runs to my hometown. The Jews who had traveled with me got out and went their way, while Gentile townsfolk, men and women, made their way in. The wheels rolled sluggishly between hills and mountains, valleys and gorges. At every station, the train stopped and lingered, let out people and baggage, and started up again. After 2 hours, signs of shibush sprouted from both sides of the road. I told you the town was called Buczacz. In his writings about the town, at least up until the Shoah, when his town and all the townsmen were completely wiped out, he satirically calls Buczacz shibush. He mixes up the letter, makes a play on words, but the word shibush in Hebrew means mixed up, muddled. In English, a translator trying to find an equivalency might call the place Muddle Town. In Yiddish, a shibishel is a tiny little nothing, a postage stamp, right? Something of no significance, meaning it's a little town. You wouldn't take note of it if you passed through it. So it's this play on words which has this dual valence, both in Hebrew and in Yiddish, which at the time his readers would have understood. So he's on the train, he's headed back home for this nostalgic homecoming, and after 2 hours of the train, signs of shibush sprouted from both sides of the road. I put my hand to my heart. My hand throbbed against my heart just as my heart throbbed under my hand. The women elbowed their way to the window, crying, "Rubberovich! Rubberovich!" and laughed. The train whistled and puffed, whistled again, and sprawled to rest opposite the station. Along came the dispatcher called Rubberovich. His left arm had been lost in the war. The new one they gave him was made out of rubber. Here the translator has taken a liberty. In Hebrew, the fellow's name is Gumavitz, gumi being the Hebrew word for rubber. The translator has just found an English equivalent to call him Rubberovich because he has a prosthetic arm made of rubber, his actual arm having been lost in the war. And he's the first of many characters throughout the novel who are maimed and damaged, mostly people who had been injured in World War I. This one's missing an arm, that one's missing a leg. Another fellow, the town beggar, is missing his nose, and he has this grotesque kind of aperture in his face, and it affects his speech. And Agnon depicts the text of his speech in a kind of way to indicate that he can't speak clearly, because without a nose it affects the way that he sounds. In a most grotesque fashion, he describes how you can hear the sound of the wind, his breath blowing in and out of this open aperture in the center of his face. It's a grotesque but probably quite accurate depiction of the injuries that so many people suffered in World War I, at a time when medicine was advanced enough to save many people who lost limbs and suffered grievous injuries, but could not, of course, rehabilitate them in ways that modern technology can. So here's Roborovich. He's the fellow that stands on the train platform waving that flag. He stood erect, waving the flag in his hand, and called, Shibush. It was many years since I had heard the name of Shibush coming from the lips of a man of my town. Only he who is born there, and bred there, and lives there, knows how to pronounce every single letter of that name. Now here, Agnon is being very playful and very intertextual. The idea that they arrive on Erev Yom Kippur, and as the train is pulling in, he hears a townsman say Shibush, pronouncing every single vowel and consonant properly of that name. That's a rabbinic text. That's a Mishnah in Masechet Sanhedrin. The Mishnah, Kol Yisrael Yesh Lehem Chelek Le'olam Haba, a very well-known Mishnah trying to describe that all the Jewish people, even sinners, have a share in the world to come. However, there are certain categories of sinners who do not enjoy a share in the world to come after death. And the Mishnah lists them. We needn't study it now, but among those that are excluded from the world to come, according to the opinion of Abba Shaul, is Af hahogeh et Hashem ba'otiotav, one who pronounces the tetragrammaton, the holy God's holy name, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, the word which is so holy that even though it's written sometimes in the Siddur and certainly in the Torah, when we read it, we don't pronounce the name the way that it's written. We substitute it with a name like Adonai. And one who would pronounce the name as it is written with all of its letters, Rambam in his commentary on the Mishnah explains what this means. To pronounce the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, the Shem HaMifurash, God's explicit name, that is enough to lock the doors of the world to come to such a person. So what is Agnon doing? By referencing between the lines of his story, this Mishnah, he enters Shibush and he hears someone standing on the platform waving the flag. Emet ma nehedar. It's Yom Kippur. It's the high priest entering the Holy of Holies, where the Kohen Gadol would pronounce God's holy name. One of the singular times of the year in which God's name is pronounced in the manner in which it is actually written. What does it mean that Roborovich is standing on a platform saying Shibush? He equates this fellow, this poor maimed fellow waving a flag in a train station, with none less than the high priest on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies. Meaning, the return to Buczacz is somehow a return to the Holy of Holies. It's Erev Yom Kippur, and we're returning, and we're coming home, but he hasn't stepped off the train platform yet. He doesn't yet know what awaits him. He doesn't yet know that the Holy of Holies, the hometown in which he was born and in which he was bred and in which he was raised and in which he was educated, where he sat and studied with his father, where he had this ideal childhood. Very often authors, particularly authors that mine their childhood in their work, have to fudge reality a bit. The American Jewish author Philip Roth, who, after all, mined biography in so many of his novels with characters who were named Philip Roth, who grew up in the Weequahic neighborhood of Newark. And people got confused and thought he was writing biography. He once famously said that I wrote a novel in the form of a confession, and people confused it for a confession in the form of a novel. But the readers could be forgiven because there's so much autobiography right there on the surface. But in fact, he had a relatively happy childhood. But he had to create tension and strife in order to make the novels interesting. I think he said something along the lines of, if I'd written it the way it was, I would have never become a great author. Nobody would be interested in that. Agnon never felt compelled to do that. He depicts Buczacz, he depicts his childhood, he depicts his family home with all of the love and tenderness which it probably did contain. But here, later in life, when he returns, there's the trauma, because you can't step in twice. We'll cut the story short, and it's a very long novel. As I said, it goes over the course of a whole year, and here in chapter 5, we've only made it through the first 24 hours. At the end of Ne'ilah, the sun stood in the treetops, close to setting. The walls of the Beit Midrash darkened, and the few candles dimly lit its duskiness. People who had not been in synagogue all day came in and stood there sadly, their eyes twitching as they looked at the cantor, who lifted up his voice and chanted the first psalm of the closing service of Ne'ilah at the end of the day of Yom Kippur. A sound of weeping rose from the darkness, like the voices of a crowd supporting the cantor in his prayer. The doors of the ark stood open, like a heavenly ear attentive to Israel's prayer. When the cantor came to the verse, "Every city is builded in its place, and the city of God is degraded to the depths of hell," he wept for a long time. This is one of the lines in the piyutim, the liturgical poetry that we add on the closing service of Yom Kippur in Ne'ilah. Kol ir al tila bnuya, ve'ir ha'elokim mushpelet ad sha'ul tachteha. Every city is builded. Look around. There's Rome, there's Athens, there's Berlin, there's London, there's New York. Great metropolises. But there's one city that lies in ruin, the city of God, Ir ha'elokim. Of course, he's referring to the Paitan, the poet is referring to Jerusalem. The comparison between Jerusalem destroyed and the metropolises of the world are enemies, standing strong. That's a source of weeping. But of course, we, the reader, knows that Agnon has once again repurposed the classical text for a different meaning. What's the Ir ha'elokim over which the parishioners in Buczacz are crying? Buczacz, or Shibush. Right? They're crying for themselves. They know that the power and force of this medieval poem is about them. That everything of the past is present. The past is prologue. And what we do in the present will shape the Jewish future. Now, the terrible irony of A Guest for the Night, of this particular novel, is that it was published, I kid you not, at the very beginning of September 1939. There were other things going on in the world the first week of September 1939. Hitler had marched on Poland, and World War II begins, and we know what happens to our people. Agnon couldn't have known, could not have predicted. Who could have predicted the full extent of the Shoah? But he's already writing a novel in which the handwriting is on the wall. The Jews of Buczacz are crying, of course, they're crying for Jerusalem. That's what the prayer on Yom Kippur is about. But they're crying about their own Jewish existence, their own physical existence in this little European hometown, this Buczacz, which was not technically a shtetl, it was more of a town, but we know what these places, we have a sense of what these places were. If not our parents or grandparents, our great-grandparents, for most of us, came from such places. And for as long as he wept at this line, so long did he raise his voice in joy at the line, Ki anu amecha v'ata Elokeinu. The lines that follow, the refrain that appears at the end of the repetition of all of the prayers of Yom Kippur. We are thy people, and you are our God. That is the story of Oreach Natalalun. That is how Agnon depicts Yom Kippur in his fiction. But it's a reflection and goes hand in hand with his nonfiction work and with the great project he set out on behalf of the Jewish people to collect the texts and the stories and the rabbinic writings and the legends of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the halacha and the Agadah, and to present it in a way that can be passed across this divide. Agnon's great friend Gershom Shalom, the great scholar of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, who had a long association with him, says that he knew Agnon first in the period in which Agnon lived abroad in Germany. During that time, Agnon had abandoned the traditional observance of his youth. And Shalom says, even then, Agnon, having abandoned observance, represented himself as someone with the bearing of tradition. And later in life, when they had returned to Jerusalem, and Agnon had, in fact, returned to traditional observance quite punctiliously, Shalom said, even in that period, nevertheless, he represented himself as someone of a completely open mind. And then he said, Agnon was someone who stands at a crossroads, like Janus, looking backward and forward, saying to those that come after, if you cannot connect to the Jewish past in its traditional form, then take it from me in my works, in my stories. Take it from someone who has looked in both directions, who understands tradition and modernity, faith and doubt, the old world and this new world that we were building here in the land of Israel, and accept the past. That's also part of the Project Takinus, of the great ingathering project of Jewish sources. It wasn't just to gather together the Mishnah and the Agadah and the Midrashim and Hasidic tales. It was to then embody them in a work of modern fiction, recognized worldwide as Nobel-worthy, to understand something about the Jewish past, because the Jewish past always impacts the Jewish present, and if we get it right, it hopefully will have a positive effect on the Jewish future, something about which we all live with the anxieties, particularly in our days. We live with anxieties about the Jewish future that even Agnon could not have imagined. In our next session, we look at one particular story, a work of fiction, one of his modernistic, surrealistic tales, in Hebrew called Pi Shnayim, available in the volume Samuch V'Nireh, in English as Twofold, translated by me, in a volume called The Outcast and Other Tales, and Beit Avichai and the publisher Toby Press have generously made a scan of the English translation available on the website associated with this course for those that want to read ahead, or for those of you that will be listening to us in the future that would like to catch up and still read the story from beginning to end, either before or after you've listened to the lecture. And I've been very proud over the years to discover that not only do people bring Agnon's Days of Awe with them to synagogues, but sometimes they even bring this translation of the story that I produced and hopefully find it meaningful. It's a story of great challenge, of how do we rise to the call and sometimes not succeed on Yom Kippur. And good luck to us all with that awesome task.